Hello, and thank you for joining us for the virtual preview tour of Perspectives, Modern and Contemporary Glass from the Waitzer collection. Today, we are joined by Dr. Jutta Page. Dr. Jutta Page is our founding executive director here at the Barry Art Museum, and we want to extend our deepest gratitude for you emerging from your retirement to research, write, and curate this exhibition. For this encore project, I understand you are accompanied by your longtime colleague, Claude Fixler, for the exhibition lighting and designing. And I just want to thank you both at the onset of this recording for all of your energy and effort in making this exhibition happen. Thank you.
It's entirely our pleasure, I can assure you.
This is a fun project. So a little bit of history. This exhibit is showcasing 165 objects that were recently gifted to the museum from Leah and Richard Waitzer. Leah and Richard Waitzer are longtime collectors, and they were lifelong friends with our museum founders, Carolyn and Richard Barry. In fact, they're the people who sort of strong-armed them into starting their own collection, and one of the primary reasons that our entire institution exists. So the friendship between these two families is really at the heart of this gift. You'll see there's a lot of work on view today. Only about 65% of the collection is on view, but we are indebted to them for this incredible gift to our growing institution. And so now you can see in the first main gallery here where we're moving through, you can see that there's a first major room here. And Jutta, I was wondering if you wanted to step back and sort of talk to us a little bit about your thinking with this space. How did you curate all of these pieces together?
As it often happens, you need to first get a really good overview of what the collection entails in order to suss out highlights, focal points, particular areas of interest, because after all, we are talking of about a very personal, private collection that dovetailed, as you said before, very nicely, of course, with the collection that the Barrys donated to the museum at the onset of the creation of this institution. So there couldn't really have been a better gift, to enlarge and enrich the existing collection that the museum already had from the onset.
It's really interesting, Jutta. I've noticed just graphically, it feels like you've chosen some really strong pieces on the outset that are not necessarily all from the same time period, but they all are extremely bold pieces. And I was wondering your thinking in this first gallery, how these particular ones all came together for you.
Well, private collections of contemporary glass have the tendency to be more apartment size works, that take into consideration the space where they will have to live in. From an institutional point of view, it is always interesting to see larger scales as well as more unusual choices, that you will not find necessarily represented in other museums that also make space, for contemporary studio glass. Well, of other institutions that have made a commitment to display contemporary glass. But in sussing out the focal points of this particular collection, it became clear that the Waitzers had a tendency to acquire significant works of art that were also larger in scale. And with that, of course, they were able to purchase works by Czech artists, and there are quite a number of them in this collection. Several of them are of smaller scale, but those artists, like the team Jaroslava Waitzer and Stanislav Lebensky from the Czech Republic, usually work on a very large scale, and often, the smaller sculptures serve as models and vehicles, to develop further ideas. That is certainly true for the victory column. That was created towards the end of their career, once the Czech Republic opened up to the West and was more closer connected. The political moment of transition is here captured in the victory column, which shows the very distinct V shape as a marker, on the signifying stele format.
Yeah, this piece gives me chills thinking about people in the streets sort of saying this V for victory. And we were just talking about the display of this work and how you have to really move around it to see the V in the way that it was intended. And one thing that I found interesting from your research is you can see in this victory column, because many institutions have these, there's these beautiful bubbles within the interior of it. And you were mentioning that it made you think that this might have been an artist proof or an earlier version of this work. Is that right?
Not quite. I truly think that this is the finished work. What is standing out for me here that makes it so beautiful as an addition to the Barry Art Museum's collection is that it also has the great work that Libenski designed, with the dove of peace on a lower gallery floor, a monumental installation that was fabricated at the Moser glass factory in the Czech Republic, which of course, has industrial capabilities to work with absolutely pure crystal glass. Whereas this one reflects more the studio manufacture that was proprietary to the Libenski studio. So you see more bubbles and inclusions in it that was intended for it, that also gave it more of an organic feel, which they, of course, very much appreciated and preferred, I should say, for their sculptural works. Both of them address peace as a theme, but the expression of it is very different.
Yes, absolutely. One very representational and one almost abstract if you don't know what you're looking for sure.
Yeah, you definitely would need to be clued into the symbolism as well as the time period when it was created. It was designed in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down and the Czech Republic opened up, as the whole East opened up to the West.
Absolutely.
People could move and travel more freely, and international exchange was much easier.
And it's interesting, there's the work of the fish eye, which I understand was a student of the Libinskis. Is that correct?
Yes, Reebok clearly was influenced, certainly in the manufacturing technique in this work, but his themes and subjects are very unique to him. He's particularly interested in marine themes, and especially the romantic idea of the romantic idea of Atlantis and creatures, of the prehistoric creatures and the environment. So I think he captures it just spot on in this kind of skeletal head that seems to be reaching out from the depths, in the last gasp of air.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. I'm going to share my screen for a second here to show the way this work was installed in the Waitzer's suburban home for a moment. And when I first was confronted by it, it was sort of disappearing back into the corner, and I didn't even really notice it until you brought it out to the forefront and made it the standalone piece as you walk into the exhibit hall. So I think it's really fascinating to see the sort of transformation of a private collection moving into an institution and how differently the installation can affect the outcome of the work.
Yes, of course, visually isolating a work of art and lighting it, giving it focus, visual focus in a museum environment, allows you to appreciate it in a very different way.
Absolutely. And so there's a couple other really interesting pieces in this opening gallery that kind of caught our attention. And one that I find to be one of the most surprising is actually the smallest artwork. And I can see visually why you paired it, but it's such a tiny piece. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this artwork for us.
Yeah, this small scale sculpture is tiny but mighty. To me, a great work of sculpture that is very small can be imagined, multiple times larger, and it still visually holds. And that's certainly true for this. If you would enlarge this to the scale, of the column, it still would be a very impressive sculpture. The details on the interior, the light raining and color changes from pink to green within this very cubist looking small flask like vessel.
One thing about this that I found really interesting is the concept of what this vessel was used for and sort of referencing these ancient tombs. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about about the Tears of the Mourners and the intended use for this piece.
Well, Antoine Le Perrier fell for the romanticism of a now debunked usage of glass vessels that have been found in ancient tombs all around the Mediterranean that were thought to contain the tears of the mourners that were added to the graves for eternity. That, of course, can no longer be upheld. But the idea lives on in Antoine Le Perrier's Lacrymatoire, or tear container, that is very precious. It seems to have the cut and the very sculptural small vessel. Is a conveying this preciousness, and it has an eternal appearance to it, almost like a sentinel, that will stand forever, and this kind of existence in perpetuity that also permeates many of the Libensky sculptures, I think rings true, for the works that were collected by the Waitzers from the Czech Republic, especially, and also, followed sort of a visual trail that leads it to this very small vessel made in France.
Yeah,
Although it is made, one should say, in a very different way. This is a pâte de verre work, which is created in a mold with small granular pieces of glass that are melted to fuse and then turn into this rather magical vessel with veils of opacity contrasting with the greenish but transparent areas.
It definitely feels monumental in scale. And initially, one of the fascinating parts of the transfer of the work here is we saw it all photographed before we saw it in person. And I imagined this piece massive when I saw this photograph. And then when it came and it was so intimate, you're right, it holds up against all of the more monumental pieces in this space. So we're going to travel now towards the American Art Nouveau and the work primarily of Tiffany. Talk to us a little bit about this alcove to the left and what people encounter when they start to enter this space.
We have two juxtaposed areas, one dedicated to American Art Nouveau and one dedicated to French Art Nouveau, which are, of course, contemporaneously parallel. So in again, looking at the collection in the form of lists, it became pretty clear that there was a focal point on the part of the Waitzers in collecting Art Nouveau, and of course that was prompted very much by the fabulous collection that the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk has. So the Waitzers loved works from that particular period, and they collected in equal numbers the work of American Art Nouveau, mostly by Louis Comfort-Tiffany, as well as French Art Nouveau, and that focusing particularly around the area around Nancy, the École de Nancy, famous Art Nouveau glass creators.
And if we were to, and I'm noticing some differences between the American and the French. It feels like the French often did a bit more, well, this Fergat Carter piece is engraved, but did a bit more engraving. And it feels like a lot of the American glass didn't have that final treatment. It really was blown and then complete. Does that feel like an accurate observation between the American and the French?
Well, I think that observation is more due to the nature of the Waitzer collection, because they loved Louis Comfort-Tiffany's work, and his especially blown pieces, were much more inspired by the organic shapes of nature, which lent itself more to the tradition of Venetian blown glass and colorations embedded in the walls and stretched and pulled and to a very organic effect. Whereas there were certainly other companies in the United States at that period that were using engraving, because the glass also was of a very different nature. So you do find an engraved and etched work by Steuben in the center of the gallery, a very unusual blue vessel, with a very Chinese inspired decoration.
Absolutely. Yeah, this one is a standout piece. And as you move around it, you can really see the level of detail and how there would have been a layer of black color over the top of the blue, and they would have engraved through the black to reveal the blue. And then on top of that, there's even more detail work. So really ornate. Absolutely.
Yeah, most of the decoration, of course, is acid etched, and that, of course, is also the preferred, manufacturing technique of the French glassmakers on the opposite side of the gallery. So we've selected this particular work as the American transition piece between the two areas that, again, are complementing each other very nicely.
Yeah, and so it does seem like there's sort of absolutely a similarity, but over here it does seem as though the French are starting to be a tiny bit more detailed in their surface treatment. And this is sort of a unique piece that you pulled out, and we're able to find some interesting history that went with it.
Well, we have to remember that the French companies were marketing internationally, as did Tiffany. However, their production was in many ways enormous, and a lot of it was exported to other European countries as well as the United States. What is interesting in the Waitzer collection is this vase called Echoes of Hellas by Bourgogne-Schwerer and Company from Nancy, which has as its decoration the frontispiece of the this particular work was most likely intended for the British market. The emblem on the front side of this vase is directly derived from a frontispiece of George War's Echoes of Hellas, The Tale of Troy, and the Story of Orestes from Homer and Aeschylus. It was illustrated by the famed British artist Walter Crane. So here's a direct translation, of something that is referencing a well-known literary work from the period, highlighting that clearly these vases were intended for a clientele of an elevated education.
And I think that that's kind of an interesting marketing approach too, that we find that's sort of unique in that, the fact that they're trying to pair it with a literary piece. Absolutely, it's very unusual. And then when we go to the next case, there's some really ornate pieces that were primarily decorative. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the usage of these two.
Yes, we have a large table centerpiece designed by Emile Gallet that is reflecting the craze of orchids at the time, and especially his emphasis of nature as he encountered in his travels around Southern Europe, especially, and the Alps. Gallet loved plants and created a lot of drawings, preparatory drawings, that then informed the works that were created in his glass factory. So this centerpiece, you have to imagine, would have been filled with water and had flowers floating in it. On the left is an Art Nouveau, very organic coupe by Dom Frere, with a grapevine decoration. Again, you almost see a silhouetted fruit and vines against a background that seems to be resembling or that seems to invoke a setting sun as well.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I'd never noticed that. And I think that it's almost visually jarring when we go to this next section, the difference between the Nouveau and then the Art Deco. And there's so many interesting differences in terms of the color and the graphics, and how it sort of is this move away from representational work into this more graphical work. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about these next two cases, and yeah, this fundamental shift.
Well, the shift from away from the Art Nouveau and towards the more graphic and bold shapes of Art Deco is quite well represented in these three bold decorations of sorry, I'm trying to find that here.
All right, so we've looked at a lot of Nouveau, very nature inspired, and then as we move into this next section of galleries, we get into a really different look. It's much bolder, it's much cleaner, and I was wondering if you could introduce where we land here.
In the 1950s, Italian glass very much came into its own again with blown vessels. It became particularly popular in the United States and was largely promoted also through the Italian government and trade connections with the United States here. So these three works are exemplary pieces really for Italian 1950s design, from the great Flavio Poli designed vessel on the right with these ribs that have a great depth to them with the addition of different layers of color inclusions, as well as shadowed little pieces of silver leaf.
Yeah. They're so neat. I mean, this triptych definitely makes me feel like I'm in a fun 50s suburban home. I feel like everything about them are just bold and beautiful, and you can really feel the time period. But then moving to our left, we get into a really different era, and this is an area that I was much less familiar with, the Costa Boda series. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about these two cases here.
On the right, you see examples collected by the Waitzers, exemplifying. On the right here, you see 4 vessels that were collected by the Waitzers that exemplify Swedish glass in particular. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hold on.
Yep, we have 3. It's interesting to see. I was less familiar with it, I guess, the Swedish glass. And here it looks like they're doing lots of patterning with powders and things that really, in some ways, are showing techniques that William Morris will then employ a little later on in the presentation. But it's interesting the level of detail they were able to achieve with these sort of dancers and this dog creature coming through. And I'm curious if these would have been considered small sculptural works, or really if it was considered something that should have been used in the home. So what was the intent of these?
Well, the artist Kjell Engman, was a staff designer for Costa Boda, was not only a painter and sculptor, but also a musician who loved music. And I think you can see that on these dancing figures, against this sky-like background here, almost like little witches in tutus floating around the vessel. It's interesting that the Waitzers acquired 2 of these. These vessels by Costa Boda, of course, were intended for the general decorative market. So we are going from the factory-made works to the studio-made works.
So this case really marks a huge shift in the studio glass movement, really the beginning of the studio glass movement. And all the works are kind of bulbous and definitely seem like they required less technique than some of the works that came before. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of these artworks?
Yes, if you remember the Italian designed vessels that we just saw, they are contemporaneous pretty much to the early studio glass works, which are represented in that particular case. The history of studio glass, of course, is a well-trodden path, and we know the key players, Harvey Littleton and Dominic Labino, and many others. There's Marvin Lipowski represented in this case at all, sort of the second generation. Its impact. The large piece in the background is unusual in that it does not represent Harvey, the maker of this particular piece, but Pavel Hlava, representing the style created by Harvey Littleton in the very beginning. That blown triple bubble is typical of the work that was created, by the early studio glass artists. And it seems a little like a tongue-in-cheek creation by a highly skilled and trained Czech glass artist, but it could also very well be considered an homage, to his friend who visited the Czech Republic at a time when the country was certainly not open to visiting foreigners.
That's
fascinating. It is not unique. There are as an individual work it is, but it is definitely part of a series. It's not the only one that Pavel Hlava created in this vein.
That's fascinating, to think about the effect that Harvey was having and sort of the repercussions all throughout Europe, of him approaching this medium in such a different and innovative way. And so now we move on to casework that really is going to dive into Harvey and his legacy, and the kind of work that he was creating and really revolutionizing the field. So sculptural and really a huge departure from all of the more production-based works that we've seen before.
Yeah, the Weitzers had a close relationship with the children of Harvey Littleton, and especially with Maureen, with daughter Maureen. So they were able to collect Harvey's work in depth, more so than any other artist. And so you see a number of works here from the 70s and 80s, that very nicely illustrate the progression of Harvey's thinking, and starting with blown vessels and then becoming more and more sculptural, bisecting the drawn out glass strands, with internal decorations, and making them into standalone sculptures that could be viewed in the round.
Yeah, it's really remarkable to see what he was able to do by this new approach of just experimenting with materiality, melting his own glass, and coming at this medium with such fresh eyes, not about industry and not about production, but really about experimentation. And the influence that he had, like we said, was widespread, and Erwin Eich became a close friend and colleague. And it feels like his work is leading the charge in a very different direction. Can you speak a little bit about Erwin's work?
Well, Erwin Eich grew up in a glassmaking family, with a background, against the background of a commercial glass factory making wine glasses and tableware. He trained as a sculptor, but then returned to his native Frauenau and designed for the factory, but he also clearly created his own work, mostly what is represented in the Waitzer collection is mold blown, not free blown, although he did that as well. Here is an homage to Picasso that he created in 1991, just a year prior to his participation in New Glass Review the following year. And he certainly references it as one of the most important ideas for him to create works that show the freedom of an artist, that is not restrained by commercial aspects or commercial thinking.
Absolutely. And, every once in a while we see a little glimpse into the personality of the collectors themselves, Leah and Richard. And I feel like this piece, to me, sort of shows some of their humor, perhaps, in collecting this kind of erotic figure of the finger.
Yes, once the finger, of course, is also mold blown and then silvered on the interior to give it a more of a reflective presence. But as you're moving around it in the back, there's an opening in the silvered background that allows a glimpse into the interior. Its exterior, almost thumbprint like space is engraved with a nude little figure lying on a cushion or pillow or blanket, very seductively. We have to remember that Erwin was also trained as an engraver, and he uses certainly all of his skills, from sculptural conceptions to trained skills of his glassmaking background in his work.
Wonderful. And then in the galleries, we have a pretty big shift here. We suddenly start to move into the 90s, and a lot of the people who followed in the footsteps of Harvey through different, as you said, like academic pathways. And here we see a sort of iconic piece of the studio glass movement by Jay Musler. Can you talk a little bit about this work?
This particular work by Musler is unusual and contrasts with the blown experimental works, of the early beginnings of the studio glass movement, and that it links really more with thinking of the art world at large, and that it uses a pre-made, factory-made, industrially made vessel as the base on which the work is conceived. It's Pyrex large laboratory flask that was cut by the artist, and it's edged and serrated to resemble this skyline of an urban environment, and potentially also, of an industrial environment set off, against the rounded hemispherical bowl that is then spray painted to receive its color.
Yeah, I love this because it almost is like a found and altered work where, yeah, there's no particular mastery when it comes to technique, but ultimately using very low-tech methodologies. It's a very clever work that kind of stands out. And then it's juxtaposed here by a Ginny Ruffner, which is a completely different glass making process, which we haven't really seen very much of yet represented in the Waitzer's collection of flame worked work by Ginny Ruffner.
Well, it's important to note that the Waitzers collected works by artists who were already established. And Ginny Ruffner certainly is the foremost, was the foremost artist working in flame worked glass on a large scale. She created first these forms, out of flame worked blown elements, almost like beads that you see here in the infinity symbols that are juxtaposed and embellished then with cold painted decorations. After all, Ginny was a trained painter originally, and applied that to her interest in flame working. She was certainly in the United States one of the first to elevate the technique of flame working that was usually more employed for creating labware and small decorative objects to something entirely different that provides, the foil for her own sculptural ideas, especially of mathematics and nature.
Absolutely. And then we get into the work of Sidney Cash. And this piece, to me, just symbolizes utter perfection of when you step back and let the glass fall and let it do what it's supposed to do. Sometimes you can achieve this level of perfection. And it's really interesting the way that he would mount these in these boxes. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Sidney and his methods.
Well, Sidney Cash was always experimental in his approach to glass. His use of graphic patterns, that are after all hand drawn and hand created. There's perhaps we're a little jaded today with all the digitally created graphics to create complex patterns, but this was all created by hand originally to provide the housing for this unique to him molten sculpture that's arrested in the molten stage, of strips of glass draped over nichrome wire, a very thin wire that could withstand, the heat required to heat up the glass in a very controlled way to create this triangular sculpture within.
Yeah, the Moray effect as you move around it is something you just have to experience in person. And then finally, you know, we get here to Marvin, and it feels like he was just he studied under Harvey. And you start to see that all of this work becomes truly sculptural, and it's moved far, far, far away from the decorative arts that we saw at the beginning of the tour with Tiffany, and of course the French makers.
Yeah, Marvin Leposky was one of the first students of Harvey Littleton's in Madison, Wisconsin, in the academic glass sculpture program there. He is best known, of course, for his mold blown and then manipulated large blown sculptures that he produced in glass centers and workshops all around the world. He traveled and was influenced then by the locale also of the factory and the individual skilled craftsmen and artists who assisted him with creating these works. This one was made at Pilchuck, where he taught many, many times and became a staple, of course. But he also, you know, created works in Sweden and in France and Russia, literally all around the world, Japan.
Yeah, well, speaking of Japan, the piece next to it is this really fascinating cage cup. Well, okay, we're going around the corner. But this cage cup was something that I thought maybe we could linger on for a second before we head over back to the Japanese space. It came to us in pieces, and that's one of the things that happens with private collections, well, really with any collection, if it's this delicate. So we were able to bring in Steve Koob, and he was able to repair the work. But talk to us a little bit about the historical underpinnings of this piece, and in this contemporary new iteration of it.
Well, cage cups were made by mostly Roman skilled craftsmen in the 2nd and 3rd century, and have been found, you know, more or less intact in graves, especially in the Rhineland or my native Cologne. There's a quite famous cage cup that always involves an inner cup and an outer filigreed shell, you know, that is connected to these little studs. And there's been, of course, a lot of discussion about how these cage cups were made. You know, we are certain now that they were all created from one piece. Although there's still a little bit of they were created from one thick piece with these little studs, almost like flying buttresses in Gothic cathedrals, you know, holding the exterior decorative shell in place. In some instances, the ancient pieces also involved zones of color with inscriptions in them, extremely elaborate and difficult to make, laborious, and they've fascinated studio glass artists who experimented with the way they were made or could be made, as in this case, you know, the exterior undulating ribbon and the interior pâte de verre shell were made separately and then attached, you know, to these struts. They were not carved from, as the ancient antecedents were, from one piece. But it is extremely fragile, and therefore, you know, is not a kind of work that survives so easily. So having one in a private collection, you know, that has survived, although in pieces, and could be restored, is a wonderful addition to the collection.
It really is. It's a fascinating piece, and we're so happy to be able to have it here. So moving around the corner, we are looking at some Japanese contemporary makers. And I'm wondering if you want to touch on some of the things that we see happening in these cases.
Hiroshi Yamano was one of the artists who was awarded the Waitzer Commission by the Corning Museum of Glass, and is one of the several artists whose work is represented in the Waitzer collection, with works that are very similar to those created for that particular award. Here he entitles his series East to West. You see fish swimming in both directions, you know, the carps that are so often appearing in Japanese decorative art as a good luck symbol. There's a cast little carp also used as a finial on top. In many ways, you know, this particular work includes glassmaking decorative techniques from soup to nuts. The individual elements are cast and then stacked together to create this sculptural vessel with the silver foil fish, you know, against the gold background, occupying the main part of the body of this particular vessel.
And then when we look towards some of the other pieces in the case next to it, we have a nice array of some other Japanese makers in the field with a variety of different techniques exhibited here.
Yes, the small box with the three pine trees on top as finials was blown by a Japanese artist who apprenticed by a Japanese glass, graduate. Naoto Yokoyama graduated from the Tokyo Art Academy and became interested in glassmaking techniques, moved to Venice for some time, completed training there, and eventually moved back to Japan, where he designed works for glass factories. This particular box from 1991 is unusual because most of the works he designed, of course, were colorless and cut and engraved works. But it is a very evocative example, I think, of combining sort of Western ideas of decoration with the Japanese form of a gift box. Another box, boxes, of course, are very important in Japanese culture. Kiyohei Fujita is best known for his mold-blown boxes with very abstract decorations of foils and almost like a Tiffany-esque colorations on the exterior. This one has a cloud shape and was created by him in the 1990s. Unfortunately, the information is lost to us for now, and hopefully at some point we will be able to identify this a little bit more closely in date range and also titles, because Fujita always assigned titles to his work. Were also included in the elaborate wooden boxes in which they were contained. Unfortunately, the box no longer exists with this work. The last work on the left is a large vase with narcissus as they grow on the water's edge in high relief on the exterior. It was created in pâte de verre, which is the chosen technique by Kimiaki Higuchi, who is known for her elaborate representations of nature on her vessels.
I always felt like she must have been influenced by all of the French Nouveau work that we were seeing earlier. And then we move ahead to William Morris. We saw one of his pieces at the onset, and this is a very different pairing of works here. So talk to us a little bit about William Morris.
Well, William Morris received his training right on site at the Pilchuck Glass School. Who was one of the early associates, early artists associated with the Pilchuck Glass School in the Northwest, and included and was inspired. Morris was very much inspired by cave paintings in caves decorated by Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. And you find quite a lot of those representations of horses and woodland creatures, in the exterior of his vessels.
Absolutely. And then
this particular work truly is a masterpiece, in that if you're looking at the vessel side that we have seen here, you can see in two different shapes, a stag and a deer, sort of back to front, top to bottom against each other, a shape that is just extraordinary, a decoration that is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, especially on such a large scale.
Yeah, it's one of those pieces, if you stand in front of a yin and yang, almost pops out at you as you're looking at it. And then this next work doesn't even look like glass. In fact, many people coming through the galleries wonder why it's on display. But it is, in fact, glass.
Yes, it is a trompe-l'oeil, if you will, in glass. Using the material not for its translucency and transparency, but for its malleability and ability to conform to organic shapes and also receive decorations on the exterior surface.
And now we get this next work sort of it's another mold blown bust. It could perhaps be similar to an Erwin Eich, but it's a very different ultimate image, even though it's also by a German artist. So talk to us a little bit about Sibylla Peretti and her body of work.
Well, this cast sculpture, it's not blown.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
I don't believe it's one. I think I truly believe it's cast. This particular sculpture, which has a plaster base that's integral to the form, weighs it down, shows a feral child with a very furtive demeanor, a squirrel, a wild animal, clinging to its shoulder, existing in an environment that seems to be threatening and unknown at the same time. That her expression seems to be trying to sense and figure out the environment that she's finding herself in. I believe it's a she. I was just wondering.
It feels like a she. It does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so all of this is leading up to this next alcove. This alcove seems to be dedicated to interior architecture. And I'm wondering if you can talk us through what we see in this section.
The display case that we are currently looking at displays some of the smaller Czech sculptures, by contrast to the large ones that we saw initially. These are much more intimate, but nonetheless very powerful, small interpretations of interior and exterior space in geometric shapes.
And then here we have a work by April Sergeant, which is referencing architecture in a very different kind of way.
April Sargent has elected to use cameo carving, which is one of the most elaborate techniques. Also has elected to use the cameo technique, one of the most labor-intensive techniques known since antiquity, for her work. She's creating the images that you find on the panels, as well as the panels themselves, in her studio in the Northwest near Seattle. You see a fleeting figure here walking against a pier, like harbor environment in the rain, that uses the different layers of glass to which she has carved, to evoke both the water beyond, as well as the reflections and the puddles on the ground, and the shadowy figure and its fleeting motion in front of it. Del Chiuli is probably is unquestionably the best known American studio glass artist, best known internationally, who laid the foundation, not only for the glass program at the Rhode Island School of Design, but also was instrumental in creating the great Pilchuck Glass School north of Seattle. His own practice very early on included large teams of artists assisting in creating these complex, blown and large-scale works and assemblages, for which he has become best known. And of course, the Waitzer also had to include several examples of his many series that he created over the years in their collection.
Okay, so in these last few cases, Jutta, it feels like we're really starting to see the culmination of studio glass in our present day, all the way from Italy to Australia. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about some of our current contemporary makers and masters of our time.
Well, with the 1990s, of course, studio glass became more and more international. And what we are seeing today, of course, is a lot of cross-fertilization between cultures and artists, who are working together, who come from different countries and working in a third country. So there's a lot of very individual work created today that we could not have imagined in the 1960s. Artists could not have dreamt of where this has been headed. And I don't think there is a parallel to that extent in any other media. It is truly unique to glass. You will not find this in ceramics or in metalwork or weaving textile design to the same extent as you find it in glass. It is a very interactive and collaborative field, that is invigorated, I think, by these constantly changing interactions and cross-fertilizations, which I find makes it particularly exciting as a field and as a field to collect, especially for an institution.
This this piece is so different from the other one, and I've never really seen one of these actually in person before, and was really surprised by the scale and really how it kind of transforms and transcends glass into something else entirely.
Well, if you look at this mask-like wall piece by Jay Musler, it really isn't a far cry from what he did with the city bulb, because it's with this urban landscape, because it's also involving pre-made pieces that he spray paints. It's just a lot more structured and in detail than the city bowl, which relies really on a very minimal um, um, effect of paint and shape and serrated sculptural edge. Whereas here you have a lot of detail within a very relatively simple structural shape of this conical mask. It's very architectural.
It is.
And
it's juxtaposed here by another rather architectural figurative work.
Yes, I was not much familiar with Robin Grieb's work. This almost life-size torso, by Robin Grieb, was inspired, as she told us, by her visits to Italy, where she noticed the buildings of successive civilization by successive civilizations, one on top of the other, in the architecture of Rome and other cities she visited. So she used that inspiration for this sculpture of a figure who seems to be creating new ideas and new sculptural forms on its own structural body.
Absolutely. And then this final piece in the exhibit, once again, I think it's so fun to end with a little bit of humor. Do you want to talk to us a bit about this work and how you chose to display it?
Well, British artist David Weekey has a distinct sense of humor that comes out in his work, as it does Dan Daly with his sculptural vessels.
What I love about ending on this piece for our viewers is you get a little bit of Richard's wit as the collector. He was a shrewd businessman and he was a real estate business person. And here we have these three men that we're supposed to be aware of in gray suits that are bearing these gifts, and the house and the fish and the key. And they're looking down their nose at you as you leave. And I think that it's just a really fun tongue-in-cheek exit to this extremely complicated installation, Jutta, that you were able to achieve. That is spanning over 150 years of glass history, if not more. And it's a real treat. It's a riot of color in there. And we're just so pleased to have had you and your expertise in building out this exhibit. I also want to thank you for the book that you authored that accompanies the exhibit, that goes into a lot of these works in much more detail, and the scholarship that you bring to the collection, and the detail, frankly, the fact that this whole collection came to us with very minimal documentation, and that it was something that ultimately you had to research every work and discover on your own. We thank you. We thank you for your scholarship and for your time and for this beautiful exhibition catalog.
My pleasure entirely. And I hope that at the end of this tour that we will be forgiven that we did not display all of the works that were given by the Waitzers to the Barry Art Museum, because with every exhibition, you have to select in order to create spaces that highlight the individual works. Less is often more, and that's certainly the case here. We wanted to be sure that we highlight the emphasis that the Waitzers had in their collection, their very distinct eye, and the great range and breadth that this collection, adds to the Barry Art Museum.
Absolutely. And for those who visit us in person, as you leave the exhibit, there's a huge amount of interpretive materials that were developed by our team, our small but mighty team here at the Barry Art Museum. And we did partner directly with the Chrysler Museum Glass Studio to develop a selection of works that emulate the Barry Bee in flame worked, solid worked, cameo, fused, blown, and stained glass form. And because we are an institution that is rooted on a college campus, we also talk a little bit about the Glass BFA program that we're blossoming here on our own campus, and think about glass through history and a timeline of where we are. So this exhibit really only focuses in on a pretty small piece of glass history, considering that it's ancient. But you can see just how much there is to unpack in this very involved media that's been around for a very long time, for ages. And on this final board right here, we really honor the legacy that the Waitzers have given us here at the Barry Art Museum, and how this glass can now inspire generations of makers and scholars to come. And also we honor the friendship between the Barrys and the Waitzer family, and how together they have really made an impact on our region. Jutta, I want to thank you for your time and for sharing all of your research with us. And we hope that all of you will come back to the Barry Art Museum and see this exhibition in person. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Charlotte.